Hello, Global Catholic Seminar participants. My name is Howard Rosing, and I'm the director of the Erwin W. Steans Center for Community-Based Service Learning at DePaul University. It's my pleasure to present to you this session on building capacity for service learning. During this session, I will present to you a variety of issues related to the service learning pedagogy in higher education, with a particular lens on how service learning is practiced within a Vincentian and Catholic university in Chicago. The Steans Center is a center that has been around since 2001 to develop mutually beneficial relationships with community organizations across DePaul's curriculum to engage students in educational opportunities grounded in Vincentian values of respect for human dignity and the quest for social justice. What is community-based service learning? Service learning dates back to the 1960s and 70s in higher education. Its predecessors, related to experiential learning, date back to the late 19th century in the work of John Dewey and individuals like Jane Addams, who immersed themselves in communities and learned about what communities can do to support themselves. The historical trends in service learning pedagogy of the 1960s and 70s framed the way in which service began to integrate into curriculum in higher education. Movements within higher education reflected the transformation of engagement of young people in society and the effectiveness of thinking through what it meant to serve or engage in activism or organizing while learning within the classroom. Service learning as a concept emerged out of that context, and by the late 1980s had developed into a practice in scholarship. As you can see by some of the publications on this page, the combining of service and learning was under development in the early 90s in a manner by which faculty at universities across the United States and in many other parts of the world began to think intentionally about what it meant to engage students with communities in serving communities and integrating it with curriculum. In particular, how curriculum was able to be applied within communities as a way to transform communities and support the goals and initiatives of those communities. In doing so, service learning was part of a movement in the 1990s to think about the transformation of universities and colleges. The first definition of service learning that was widely published was in 1995 by Bringle and Hatcher. Service learning is a credit-bearing educational experience in which students participate in an organized service activity that meets identified community needs and reflect on the service activity in such a way as to gain further understanding of course content, a broader appreciation of the discipline, and an enhanced sense of civic responsibility. Take note of some key elements of this early definition. Credit bearing, in other words, linked to courses within the curriculum and credit. Community needs, a framework that we now think of within the context of community assets, but with a focus here in the 1990s on listening to what communities are interested in. Course content, particular focus on how students can use the experience within the community, serving within the community, to better understand course content. An appreciation of the discipline in order to enhance a sense of civic responsibility. In other words, attaching the relationship between the discipline one is trained in and a greater sense of civic responsibility to use those skills and talents to transform society. This model of service learning, what we now call academic service learning at DePaul, combines then the relevant and meaningful service with the community, an enhancement of academic learning, and the purposeful civic learning that takes place when reflection occurs within courses. That reflection that integrates the experience of service and the curriculum is what we call academic service learning. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, there was an institutionalization of service learning within higher education that led to centers like the Steans Center across North America and now across the world. The distinction here was to distinguish volunteerism, internships, community service, field education from service learning that's embedded within the curriculum. This institutionalization process brought with it a heavy emphasis on understanding where students are learning from service learning. In other words, what contributes to the learning process when students go out and engage with communities in a reciprocal fashion and then bring it back into the classroom and integrate it with course concepts, theories, methods, and so forth. This strong emphasis on institutionalization of service learning brought with it many, many evidence-based studies that developed a scholarship in service learning that's well developed now with its own set of journals and publications dating back to the early 1990s. Again, early on, this scholarship focused heavily on student learning, eventually focusing more on faculty development of service learning pedagogy skills, and now even more so on the question of community impact and the role of community partners and partnerships in service learning, course development, and institutionalization. The Carnegie Foundation also provided a service learning definition, referring to it as a method of teaching, learning, and research that describes interactions between universities and their communities, business, industry, government, NGOs, and other groups, for the mutually beneficial exchange of knowledge and resources in a context of partnership and reciprocity. Take note here of the key elements: teaching, learning, research, interaction between universities and communities, mutually beneficial exchange, in the context of partnership and reciprocity. All of these elements are important features of service learning pedagogy. Carnegie began in the middle of the first decade of the millennium to develop a classification for community engagement. That classification, now in its third iteration, has a number of institutions that follow the pathway of integrating service and community engagement into curriculum and across disciplines throughout universities and colleges. DePaul was one of the first recipients of the Carnegie Foundation classification in 2006. By that time, our institution had developed well over 100 courses that contained a service learning component. And by the end of that decade, over 200 courses, where today we support more than 3,800 students a year from some 200 plus courses across 10 colleges and schools. By the end of the first decade of the century, scholars began to think more critically about the concept of service learning. They began to speak about how to reframe the way students think about their own identities within the context of privilege, and how service learning had to be constructed within the framework of understanding the distribution of power, or unequal distribution of power, and its relationship to issues of social justice. Scholars such as Tania Mitchell coined the term critical service learning to speak about social change orientation, working to redistribute power, and to develop authentic relationships. Critical service learning became a topic across higher education service learning throughout the last decade. More recently, scholars have begun to talk about decolonizing service learning, helping students to understand the layers of history and colonization that have led to and contributed to unequal distribution of power, including within the academy, and how that relationship between the academy and the communities that surround it reflect that colonization process. The question became, how do we begin to practice service learning with communities around our universities with this critical mindset implanted within the context of courses, faculty teaching, and student learning? I'd like to shift now to understanding some frameworks for thinking about service learning pedagogy. Service learning practice typically follows Kolb's experiential learning cycle, where students engage in concrete experiences within communities, returning to the classroom to reflect on those experiences, engaging in abstract conversations around theories, concepts, and methods, applying those theories, concepts, and methods back in the community through concrete experience, returning to the cycle throughout an academic term. The critical piece here that makes service learning within Kolb's model is the reflective component that combines the experience of students partnering with communities and the abstract concepts, theories, and methods introduced within curriculum. Another framework for thinking about how to develop service learning practice is asset-based community engagement from the approach asset-based community development. How do we begin to guide students towards entering communities through an asset lens rather than a deficit lens? How do we ensure that they understand that communities have individuals with skills and talents, associations that they create that have power and can make change in society, that they have intellectuality at the community level already, that there's community level education taking place? How do we begin to change the focus away from a needs or deficit based service learning practice to a more asset lens? How do we help students view the glass as half full rather than half empty? Rather than seeing people and communities as deficient and needy, but people as powerful with assets and capacities. This approach begins through understanding the assets of community, from the gifts and talents of individuals to the associations they create, to their links to institutions, and to the power of building support for what already is working within communities and supporting further development of communities from within. I'd like to shift now towards the framework of thinking about learning objectives within the context of developing service learning pedagogy. Service learning begins with establishing the learning goals and objectives of your course. How can experience intentionally developed with community partners contribute to meeting course learning objectives? What the students are doing with the community should be directly aligned with the goals and learning objectives of the course. It's critical to establish this ahead of time and to articulate it within syllabi as clearly as possible for students. When students finish your course, what skills and attitudes should they have? What theories, concepts, methods did the experience contribute to better understanding? In what ways will the student leave your course having better learned the material from engaging with communities in a manner that respects the interest of those communities and is developed reciprocally in partnership with those communities? The next framework is to think about the basics of developing service learning practice. Credit is always for learning. What students learn from experiences, not the experience itself. Courses remain academically rigorous, with texts, with lectures, with critical analysis, with problem solving, and with all the same types of learning tools that integrate with service learning as a teaching method. Service learning should always, again, be about accomplishing the learning objectives alongside other teaching methods. How do students develop critical analysis of materials, develop critical thinking skills? How do they begin to think about the community as co-educators rather than recipients of service? This changes the faculty role within the classroom because students are now bringing in knowledge from the community to be integrated with other forms of knowledge presented within the course. Utilizing these frameworks, I would like to move now towards understanding certain modalities and examples of community-based service learning. At DePaul, we think of 4 different types of service learning, which we call modalities: direct service, project-based, community-based research, and advocacy and solidarity. Direct service is what typically people think about when students are out in the community supporting existing programs within community-based organizations, such as working in a homeless shelter, working in an after-school program, supporting an English as a second language program, or working in a soup kitchen. The difference is direct service assignments in the community are directly related in a linear fashion to curriculum. Students working in an after-school program with teenagers may be in a course in adolescent psychology. Students working with English as a second language students may be exchanging an hour of Spanish conversation for an hour of English conversation, while the students are taking intermediate Spanish. Project-based service learning results in tangible products, such as maps for community partners, documentary films, technical documents, any type of project that leads to a product that community partners receive as a result of partnering with the course. Community-based research, a type of project-based service learning, involves students who are actively involved in research defined by community partners themselves. This could be students engaging in evaluation of a program, students involved in collecting interviews for an organization looking to understand how to better serve its population, students researching a form of injustice to contribute to developing a policy initiative. Advocacy or activist learning involves students directly involved in campaigns. Students, for example, may be working on campaigns to respond to racism or gender discrimination while enrolled in a course in peace, justice, and conflict studies or sociology. Other students may be involved in food justice campaigns, working alongside restaurant workers seeking fair wages and benefits, or working to support farm workers while involved in a course focused on food justice. Lastly, solidarity is a form of engagement where students work alongside those who are experiencing oppression. The two major forms of this at DePaul University involve students taking courses alongside incarcerated students at two prisons in the Chicago area. We call this the Inside Out program, and it's part of a national program, Inside Out Prison Exchange program. At DePaul, we think it's important to bring faculty together regularly to reflect upon, strategize about, and develop new ways of thinking about how to practice service learning. We offer quarterly workshops to help faculty understand and share with each other how service learning has effectively supported student learning, faculty teaching and scholarship, and community benefits. As stated earlier, it's important to take a critical perspective on service learning. There may be incredibly good intentions in developing service learning projects with communities, but in the end, we can end up doing harm. Over 20 years ago, author John Eby wrote an article called "Why Service Learning is Bad." In the article, Eby argued a number of points as to why service learning can do harm. One of those was that service learning grows from mixed motives. He said often service learning is organized to respond to the needs of an academic institution which sponsors it, the needs of students, the needs of an instructor, or the needs of a course. Abby also said that service learning is based on a simplistic understanding of service. When service learning is done without proper selection of students and without appropriate training, orientation, and reflection, it can support ineffective and sometimes harmful kinds of service. Abby said that service learning can teach a false understanding of need. By defining needs as deficiencies, students are able to separate themselves from the problems they encounter. They fail to see that often the same social structures which work well for them create the needs in the communities in which they do service learning. Service learning can divert attention from social policy towards volunteerism. If service learning diverts effort from social policy initiatives to volunteerism, it will do a major disservice to those it is designed to help. Service learning, Abby said, encourages diversion of agency agendas. The existence of a ready source of well-motivated and generally competent service learning volunteers encourages agencies to divert energies to meet the needs and interests of the volunteers, sometimes at the expense of their own mission. Lastly, service learning can do harm. Abby said that service learning has potential to do actual harm to individuals, particularly children with whom students work. At the Steans Center, we think a lot about this as we're working with youth. If our students come in and out of their lives, we may actually cause more disruption. How do we address that is a question we continuously think about. Looking at service learning pedagogy through a critical lens offers us the opportunity to really understand how to ensure that we get the most important positive outcomes from service learning practice. Coming together to think critically about how service learning operates at your university or institution is an important process that takes place not only among faculty and staff, but also within the classroom as you consider the ways that your engagement may actually affect negatively or positive the communities you're seeking to serve with. I'd like to discuss now the faculty roles and commitments when engaging in service learning. Faculty need to first decide on a modality, an approach to service learning that works best for their curriculum. To do this, they need to engage in deep consideration of their learning goals and objectives, and which modality, which approach would best fit and align with meeting the learning objectives of the course. Sharing those course details with community partners is extremely important early on in the process of developing any kind of service learning curriculum. Partnering with those who can support you at your institution that support academic service learning is an important step in ensuring that the institutional partnerships are supported rather than one-off partnerships that can happen when you're only teaching periodically with the service learning component. It's important to challenge and both challenge and support students while engaging them in the community. It's important to address any kind of concerns that you have about the potential for the students to do harm on the community, while also supporting them in their learning process. It's important for faculty themselves, whenever possible, to build relationships with community partners as part of the service learning development process. It's important to integrate reflection whenever possible within courses. Lastly, it's important to showcase or celebrate and present on the findings of a service learning experience, that students can see the culmination of their work and their engagement in the community, and even more so, that others at the university and perhaps the community members themselves get to participate in any kind of showcasing of important work that's done through curriculum with communities. I'm going to shift now towards what might be considered the most important component of service learning pedagogy development: reflective practice in the service learning pedagogy. Reflection, as stated earlier, is the key to successful service learning practice. Regardless of what discipline you're in, reflection is what brings together the experiential with other forms of learning within the classroom and texts. Instructors can focus on a variety of different types of in-class reflection that will involve students in either compartmentalized way, where faculty are introducing materials through lectures and discussions, and then having compartmentalized reflection component that looks at the materials from the lens of the experience the students are engaged in. Or there's a possibility for faculty to take a more integrative approach, where they're lecturing and discussing issues and regularly integrating student reflections within those lectures and discussions. Shifting to the question of how to evaluate service learning pedagogy, we at the Steans Center believe it's important to evaluate every aspect of the service learning practice from the perspective of students, faculty, and community partners. At DePaul, we evaluate quarterly all of our service learning courses from all three of these constituents. We encourage faculty to also provide students with feedback in a formative fashion to their learning while within the course structure itself, where faculty can begin to understand how students are learning the material better as a result of the experience they have working within the communities. Equally important is to have a more summative evaluation process, where students are able to articulate in broader terms how their experience helped them better understand the topic of the course and the knowledge and skills relayed through the curriculum. It's important to think through ahead of time how both formative and summative evaluation or assessment of students will take place. Assessment and evaluation provide rich material for publishing on the service learning as a practice. as well as for doing research on service learning and its impact on various constituents. There are numerous journals, peer-reviewed journals, that support service learning related publications. There are numerous associations that support service learning practice. The International Association for Research on Service Learning and Community Engagement, for example, holds an annual conference as well as supports a peer-reviewed journal. In Catholic higher education, UNISERVITATE has recently emerged to promote service learning in Catholic higher education. Its objective is to generate a systemic change in Catholic higher education institutions through the institutionalization of service learning as a tool to achieve its mission of offering an integral education to the new generations and involving them in an active commitment to the problems of our time. UNISERVITATE states that they focus on transformation of teaching practices in Catholic higher education institutions, stating that service learning proposes to articulate academic activities with social commitment, thus strengthening the spiritual identity of Catholic institutions. I encourage you to explore more deeply the work of UNISERVITATE and to perhaps join one of their networks. Thank you for participating in this session on building the capacity for service learning. Please feel free to reach out to me at hrosing@depaul.edu if you have any questions or would like to explore service learning at your institution.